Hello and welcome back to Tinker Talks Guns. This time we're going to talk about handgun stopping power again, because there's a lot of very sketchy information and opinions floating around. Why shouldn't I share mine? I started following this in the early mid-1980s and have been following it consistently ever since. From the days of the 9mm versus .45 debate right on up to modern times. And I've read a lot of articles, I've read studies, I've read all manner of materials, and most of them have left me deeply unimpressed. But one recent effort stands out. Just a few years ago, Greg Elefritz published a series of articles to re-examine what we know about stopping power. And he did this by reviewing more than 1,600 cases of real-world shooting incidents, both in civilian self-defense, on police or military duty. And he was able to draw some conclusions from this. And those conclusions were so bizarre on the face of them that people who only quote that find it very implausible and come up with a lot of really bizarre ideas. What they missed was that Greg also wrote follow-up articles explaining the methodology, the qualifications, and a variety of other relevant factors, because bullets are not necessarily the most relevant factor in handgun stopping power. According to the FBI, what you need in this order are penetration, hit location, and a permanent wound cavity, with a larger permanent wound cavity being better than a small one. Penetration is first because you have to reach the stuff you need to break to make the bad guy stop doing what the bad guy is doing. Hit location is important because there's a hell of a lot of the human body you can put a bullet through without making the person need to stop. A lot of people will stop short of needing to. This is called a soft stop, and we'll get back to that later. And lastly, the permanent wound cavity, because the size of the permanent wound cavity, bigger is better because it damages more things, and it's more likely to damage something that will make the bad guy stop doing what the bad guy is doing. So that's all relatively straightforward. You have to get to the stuff you need to break, you have to hit the stuff you need to break, and once you do, it's good to do the most damage to it possible. That's pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, it's the only thing about this that is. So, what round, in these 1,600 shootings, what round was the most likely to produce a one-shot stop? Was it .44 Magnum? No, it was not .44 Magnum. Was it .45 ACP? No, it was not .45 ACP. Was it 9mm? No. So what was this miraculous round that produced the highest percentage of one-shot stops? .22 long rifle. And no, not because it's 100% bounce around death round. It has to do with the shootings that they were involved in, because not all shootings, or even classes of shootings, are created equal. We're going to dive deep into this in a few minutes, but first, I'd like to thank my supporters on Patreon. All of this costs money. Your contributions help more than you know. If you would like to join my supporters on Patreon, there's a link in the description below. I'd also like to help channel benefactors who have provided ammunition for testing, who have provided guns for me to show you and talk to you about, and a variety of other really helpful things. So, excuse me. So thank you all for your various contributions. It all helps, and it all helps make this work. So then, let's see how deep the rabbit hole goes. When I was initially paying attention to this discussion in the early 1980s, we tended to talk about knockdown power. And in the fullness of time, this term fell out of fashion, largely because it was stupid. Handgun bullets do not knock people over. A bullet that will knock over the bad guy on one end will knock over the shooter on the other end, generally speaking, because of something called physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Under specific circumstances, like if a person is already very off balance and a big bullet hits a big bone, it is not inconceivable that it could knock them down. But they'd fall down because they were already off balance, not because the bullet helped them. So, we adopted the term stopping power. And the first thing we need to establish is, what does stopping power mean? Presumably, if someone is getting shot within legal constraints, if they're getting shot for a legally defensible reason, it's because they're doing something. And the need to stop them is so overwhelming that it is incidental whether they are severely injured or killed as a result of being stopped. Generally speaking, this means the shooter or another innocent person is in immediate danger of suffering death or grave bodily harm. Okay, that's why you stop someone. And it does affect what it means to stop someone by shooting them with a handgun. Because if they stop doing the thing that made it necessary for them to be shot, that counts. Broadly speaking, stops with handguns fall into two, or rifles or shotguns or whatever, fall into two categories. The soft stop, where you shoot them and they go, "Nope, I'm done," and either run away or drop their gun, sit down. Whatever they were doing that made it necessary to shoot them, they stop doing it. That is legitimately a stop, because the purpose is not to kill them, it's to stop them, and they're stopped. I typically refer to this as a soft stop. A hard stop is where, in order to get them to quit doing what they're doing that makes it necessary to shoot them, you have to render them physically incapable of continuing that action. The most reliable way to do this, generally speaking, is a solid hit to the central nervous system, the brain or upper spine, or to the circulatory system, major elements of it like the heart or aorta, or to a lesser degree the jugular vein or whatever. Typically, though not always, if you hit someone with a bullet in the heart, or in the aorta, or in a major vein in the neck, the femoral artery in the leg, the brachial artery, typically they're going to collapse within 25 to 40 seconds from a catastrophic loss of blood pressure. Not always, and we're going to encounter not always a lot in this discussion. So a stop is when you make the bad guy stop what they're doing. This can be a soft stop, where they give up the fight by running away or surrendering, or a hard stop, where they stop because they're physically unable to continue taking action. Okay? So, different people are likely to encounter different types of assailants. It's not a hard and fast rule, but typically civilian self-defense shootings are engaged against a criminal who wants something. What the criminal does not want is to be shot. So when the shooting starts, very often they will flee if possible, whether you hit them or not. And I have only anecdotal evidence of this, but a fellow who has reviewed over 3,000 security cam footage, the footage of over 3,000 shootings caught on security cams, says that overwhelmingly, when a robber or other miscreant is shot, the first thing they do is try to run away. And typically, they only resort to fighting when they are prevented from running away. There are exceptions to this rule, of course. There are always exceptions to every single rule there is. Law enforcement officers and military are more likely to encounter a committed attacker. This is someone who is determined to take them out at any cost. If you shoot them, they will not run away. They will continue pressing their attack. So, what do police shoot people with? These days, most often, they shoot them with 9mm, 40 Smith & Wesson, or to a lesser degree, 45 ACP. These rounds all have adequate penetration. They are all capable of being fired with sufficient accuracy, and with modern defensive ammunition, they produce an enlarged wound track. So, good choice. The thing is, 22s are almost universally used for self-defense by civilians. And we've already said, in most cases, any gunshot wound will cause them to flee if possible. In many cases, with the police, a single gunshot wound will not cause them to flee if possible. It will cause them to try and fight harder and faster so that they can disable the police officer or soldier and survive. Now, this skews the raw statistics of Greg's survey of shootings, because different calibers have different applications. Yes, civilians do use service caliber cartridges for self-defense, but they also use things like 22, 32 ACP, 32 Smith & Wesson long, 380 ACP, all manner of cartridges that do less physical damage and have less penetration in many cases than service caliber cartridges. Now, that changes the results. If you were able to isolate cases where someone faced a determined attacker, what happens then? Greg also determined the failure rate of different cartridges to stop an attacker with any number of shots. That seems like a fairly good metric for determining whether or not when someone is facing a determined attacker. He found that service calibers and magnums all worked fairly equally. Not identically, but the sample sizes and the percentages were such that you cannot definitively say that one definitively worked better than the others. And service calibers are 38 Special, 357 Magnum, 9mm, 40 Smith & Wesson, 45 ACP, and 10mm. And even 44 Magnum, if you throw it into the mix, did not, statistically speaking, create significantly more stopping effect. Yes, it does more damage. In practical terms, we know. But there are a lot of variables in a gunfight. What he discovered was that pretty much service calibers and above had a 15% failure rate to stop an attacker with any number of shots. Calibers 32 and smaller had a roughly, I'm rounding things off here, a 30% chance of failing with any number of shots. They were twice as likely to fail to stop an attacker. We can presume these are the people who don't run away. So, does this mean we should all carry 22s? Absolutely not, even for civilian self-defense, because if the person doesn't run away, you've got twice as much chance this is going to fail to stop them. By the way, 327 Magnum was not included because I don't think he found any shootings involving 327 Magnum. It was a pretty new cartridge then. It's often said that a bigger hole is better, and according to the FBI's findings on permanent wound cavities, it's true. Bigger is better. So, a 45 is better than a 9mm, right? I mean, it's this much larger in diameter. That's got to make a huge difference. The fact of the matter is, in soft tissue, 45 does not make a bigger hole than 9mm because we're stretchy beasts. And human tissue stretches when the bullet hits it and compresses behind it. So, medical examiners often report that they can't tell just from the bullet hole in many cases what size caliber the person was shot with unless they find the bullet. And that's because tissue stretches, partly gets out of the way of the bullet, and it closes in behind it. Now, surely a 45 caliber expanding bullet that expands to 75 caliber is going to do more damage than a 9mm that expands to 60 to 65 caliber. But it's not going to do much more damage. So this is maybe part of why across service calibers, bigger bullets are not necessarily more effective in real-world shootings. Now, there is some anecdotal indications that 10mm and 357 Magnum may be more effective than 9mm 40 Smith & Wesson and 45 or 38 Special. But again, it's not that simple. Okay, yes, they do more damage. Whether that more damage is enough to affect the outcome of a gunfight taking place over a span of seconds is up for some debate. The other thing is context. A police officer carrying a 10mm or a 357 Magnum, these being atypical calibers, is more likely to be a skilled shooter. And that means that they may be more likely to get better hit locations than somebody firing a lesser caliber. It's complicated and it's chaotic. We can't say for certain, even though intuition tells us that it ought to be more effective, it's more powerful. A British officer, speaking of the Webley 38-200 revolver, said the 38 is a fine man-stopper. Shoot them through the skull and they drop in their tracks. Hard to argue with that. The thing is, You have to be able to do that. And you are the final variable in the equation of stopping power. Maybe you are so good that you can be absolutely certain of achieving a hard stop fast enough to do you any good with a 22. I don't know, maybe you are. Most of us are not willing to count on that level of skill, and frankly, most of us do not organize our lives around training for the vanishingly rare chance that we will need to stop a bad guy by shooting them with a handgun. We train until we reckon we're good enough. If you are a lifestyle shooter who just likes shooting and finds training fun, it's not going to be useless. Go ahead, have a ball. Spend the money, spend the time, more power to you. But for the average person, they just want what works for them and their perceived needs. Look at your situation, judge your likely needs, and make your decisions accordingly. If you have constraints, physical constraints from injury or other infirmity or age or whatever, if you take what works for you, it will probably work as long as you can do your part. And your part is putting hits where they need to go consistently, reliably, and preferably quickly. Do what works for you. Stack the odds if you can, because you're probably never going to need to shoot someone, but if you do, it's going to be really, really important that it works. Anyway, you've watched words come out of my head for long enough. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was useful to you. And I hope if you liked the video, you'll take 5 seconds out of your busy life to expend virtually no effort to click the like button, because it really helps the channel. And if you want to see more videos like this, and like a lot of other things, gun-related, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and that helps you and it helps the channel. So, I hope this finds you well. Stay safe, take care, and we'll talk to you again real soon.